Hi, I'm Michael from Made It For Me, and I'm going to show you how to make Rumi's sword from K-pop Demon Hunters. Before we get started, I want to give a huge shout out to Cortec Inc. for making the design for the Rumi sword, and they gave me the licensing so that I could actually sell on Etsy, which is in the description below if you would like to purchase one today. First, I started by printing out the parts out of this PETG gradient blue and purple filament from bottom to top on the blade individually, one at a time. And then I started by also printing in gold for the handle and also the guard. I used clear JB Will 2-part epoxy to connect all the pieces together. I used some painter's tape to hold the pieces in place while the 2-part epoxy cured, and I placed it on a nice flat surface so it won't bend while it was curing. I modified the guard so that you could put a charging port and a switch in, and then also control it with just one hand. For you to solder, you will need a few things. Example, you will need a traditional iron with a nice clean tip, and also some 26 gauge wire, and also of course some solder. The best way to explain how soldering works is that the hot tip attracts the solder to whatever you heat up. So once you heat up the object and then the solder, it attracts the solder to the object. So we will start by heating up the wire. Once the wire is hot enough, then we'll heat up the solder so that it melts and attracts the solder to the wire. As you see, once the solder is heated up, it is able to attract and be fluid on the wire itself. Now that we have some solder on the wire and the middle part of the switch, which we will attach to the battery, we will then connect the wire to the switch by melting the solder and making our strong connection. Once the solder cools, you should have something like this. Next, we connect another red wire to either end of the switch. This wire will be connected to the LEDs. Make sure to only use red wires when soldering on the switch, since this will only break up the positive connection of the circuit. Once you have shrink tube your wires, then you can put them into the guard and you should have something like this. This is the charging module for the whole LED circuit. This is how you're able to recharge the battery after a long day of usage. Luckily, everything is labeled, so it's pretty easy to figure out where everything goes on the board. Here's a layout of how everything is connected to the board so you don't have to keep on repeating the video over and over. I started by connecting the middle part of the switch to the out part of the charging board. Then I started connecting the USB-C port to the in part of the board. For those of you who don't feel comfortable soldering a wire to a battery, you can just strip away enough wire to attach it with some electric tape, and that will do it just for this project. I decided to do it just because I know it's a strong connection, and I've done this a few times, so I at least have some experience on how to solder a battery to it. To solder the wire to the battery, you will need to go ahead and scratch away a little bit so it has a nice rough texture for the bottom end of the battery. Then you will need to solder a lot of solder onto the wire so that the solder could make a nice quick connection to the bottom of the battery. Then we will separate the red and the black wires so that you could go ahead and make a nice flat connection to the battery at the top. Again, make sure you have a lot of solder on your wires so that it makes a nice quick connection at the top. A good way to test if all the circuits make their strong connection is just tap a little LED diode to the red and black wires. Next, we will connect the black wire that connects to the LEDs to the circuit board. Now that the module has all the wires connected, you can place the module inside the guard facing outward. Then feed the black wire that goes to the LEDs to the other side of the guard. You should have the black wire from the module and the red wire from the switch on one end of the guard. Now it's time to move on to the blade. Once the 2-part epoxy is done curing, now it's time to grab your LEDs. You can find a link to the LEDs in the description below. First, you're going to take your LEDs and measure it to the length of the blade itself. Once you have a length that feels comfortable, you will go ahead and connect both sides of the adhesive LEDs to each other, starting from the end where you measured. Then cut off the excess LEDs at the end. If you have connected the adhesive sides of the LEDs to each other, you should have something like this. Then we connect the red wire from the switch and the black wire from the module to the LEDs. Again, make sure you heat up the wires before attaching the solder to make sure it stays on strong. As always, it's good to run a little test. For the handle, I took 2 small LED diodes and bent the wires towards each other and connected a small wire towards each other so that they could wrap around the battery inside the handle. After the 2 LED diodes were soldered to each other, I connected 2 longer wires to connect to the circuit. You should finally have something like this. Next was to shove the LEDs inside of the blade, making sure that the LEDs were all facing the same side. Next, I put some 2-part epoxy onto the blade and handle, sealing the LEDs inside, making it watertight. After this, you should be all done. When it's charging, the red light means it's charging and the blue means that it's fully charged. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. I had a lot of fun making this. Ooh. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I really hope you enjoyed, and feel free to like, comment, subscribe to the channel. And as always, you can find me on my TikTok or Instagram if you have any commissions in mind or have any recommendations for the next video I make. And as always, this is how I made it for me.